Hey everyone, and welcome to La Roche FM, a podcast where design and business meet in the same place. Weekly talks with industry experts on how they do it. Let's begin the show. Our today's guest is Blair Enns. Hello, Blair.
Hello, Eugeniu.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Blair Enns, founder and CEO of Win Without Pitching. Win Without Pitching is the sales training organization for creative professionals. So we work with typically independent design-based businesses, but also businesses that are kind of adjacent to that, where typically the founder is a creative person, and we help that person get better at selling. So it's sales training for creative professionals. I probably, unlike most traditional sales training, we really focus on our audience. We understand creatives, and our audience is really people who see themselves as creators first and salespeople second, or maybe third or fourth.
What's your background? How did you get into the creative field?
Yeah, that's a long time ago now. I stumbled into it, but it was almost like it was like preordained. I kind of stumbled into advertising. I fumbled my way through. I was academically expelled from university after 1 year. I went to a community college and took a business administration program. And then I graduated from that and thought I wanted to work in public relations. I wanted to do something that was writing based. I either wanted to get into business or I wanted to write. So I was kind of on the fence. And for some, public relations seemed to straddle the fence of those two things. I applied for a job with a PR firm. I did not get it. I was surprised that I didn't get it. That's how overconfident I was in my youth. But they came back a little while later and said, "Hey, we bought an ad agency. We'd love for you to come work on the advertising side of the business." And I thought, okay, yeah, I'll do that for a little while, and then I'll move over to public relations. And then I fell in love with advertising. Then I fell out of love with advertising, and I kind of moved into the design profession. I was always on the account services and business development side of the business, so I was a suit. And yeah, that's how I got into the creative professions. I just stumbled into it.
Mm-hmm. So how was it working, balancing between the clients and the creatives for you? Was it hard?
Yeah, I remember a meeting with a client. We were somewhere at some event. It was a big event. I don't remember what it was, but I remember the client apologizing to me. He said, "Blair, I got to hand it to you. I don't know how you deal with us. We're such a handful." And I looked at him. I said, "Are you kidding me? You guys are a piece of cake. It's my own people. That's where an account person earns his or her badge. It's interfacing between the two, but usually I found that the biggest challenges were communicating with my own people. The client I found actually fairly easy to deal with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what were your challenges by communicating with creatives? I mean, transmitting the idea of what client wants, or?
I think it was, even I always loved creative. And to this day, I mean, our business is built around the idea that there's people see themselves, I'm a big kind of believer in the idea of archetypes. And I think there are creators. There are people who are put on this earth to create. And those people who, so we work with those people creators who've turned their kind of calling into a business. So I've always liked working with creatives, even when they were difficult. It's usually the logistics of getting things. Maybe I just wasn't very good at getting what I needed or wanted out of my fellow colleagues. I like the temperamental creative people, the people who needed more. We were selling units of time. We were selling their expertise in units of time, but the really good ones, they just would not be held to that constraint. So that the ideas would come, like I, the account person, would get what I wanted when it came to them, and it wasn't on my schedule. And I was actually pretty okay with that, and I was pretty good at pushing back on the client on that. But I think it's getting things produced, production issues, communicating with other logistical people. I always really liked and identified with the creative people, and the freakier, the better. The more weird their habits, the better. It's kind of something that's when the creative. I use the term kind of lovingly, freaky creative people. When the creative people are really freaky, it seems to be an easier sell.
More creative ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you wrote the book Win Without Pitching Manifesto, and you also have a company, Win Without Pitching. So what was, how did you decide to write a book and then open a company based on the book or so?
Yeah, and it was the other way around. I decided to open the company first. Really, I got kind of fed up with the advertising profession. I was working in one of the largest agencies in the world, and I was working for somebody who, I think with the passage of time, I can more magnanimously say a person who had kind of individual struggles, who was very successful professionally, but was very difficult to work with. And she really pushed me out of advertising, made me kind of despise it for a little while. And it wasn't anything about the advertising profession as much as it was working for her and working in a company that would allow somebody to behave the way she behaved. So that I decided that I was going to leave that organization, kind of manifested my own firing. And then I thought I was going to move to this little remote village in the middle of the mountains of British Columbia. And that's where I live now with my wife and children. But at the time, we had this idea that I would drop out of the advertising profession. I thought I would make furniture or something, and I'm not very good with tools. So I thought we would retreat to the hills. We would homeschool our children. We'd kind of go back to the land. And so when I was let go from this large firm, the weight of the world just lifted off my shoulders. I thought I was going to sue my employer. I kind of set it up. Okay, I'm going to get fired, and then I'm going to sue her and the company. And I was really kind of wrapped up in this really bad mental space. And as soon as she fired me, she had this great line. She said, "I'm going to." I forget what it was. I'm going to free you up to pursue other things or something. She handed me a small severance package, and when in that moment I felt the weight of the world lifting from my shoulders. I thought, I'm not going to sue you. I'm never going to see you again. And then so we were going to move to the woods, and then I got a call from a headhunter about going to work in a design firm. At the time when we found out my wife was pregnant with child number 3, so I thought, well, I'll interview with this person. I was busy trying to learn how to make furniture, and I was horrible at it. And then I thought I would interview this guy, and he was a wonderful designer who ran a really creative design firm. At the time, the business part of it wasn't all that put together well. But so I went to work for him. I said, I'll work for you for a year, and then I'm moving. And a year turned into almost 2 years, and I fell back in love with the creative professions, and designers in particular. You know, I kind of grew up first in advertising, but ad people are different than designers. I like ad people, but I have a very strong affinity for designers. I love designers. A designer wants to solve the problem and save the world.
So why did you decide to train people? To have this entire thing of training agencies on how to run their business?
Yeah, sorry, that was a long, rambling answer that didn't answer your question. So I wanted to move to this village. We decided, okay, well, how are we going to earn a living here? There's really no commerce beyond logging and marijuana growing, which is still illegal here, but only for a few more months. So those were really the only industries here. And I decided, well, I'll become a consultant. So the idea of Win Without Pitching was born. I had gone through some sales training late in my career, and I realized that the logic of how to properly sell was completely missing from the creative professions, and I kind of explored why is that, and I decided to build a business around that. And then so that allowed us to move to this place. We raised kids while I was a consultant. I wrote the Win Without Pitching manifesto because I love manifestos, and I've always wanted to write one. And I was quite nervous about the tone of voice in that book. It's very kind of over the top, like we shall, with these proclamations. But I really really enjoyed writing it, and I felt like it's something that kind of came through me and was meant to exist. So I just loved the experience of putting that book out into the world, and I'm to this day, 7.5 years later, I'm still quite proud of it.
The book is divided overall in 12 chapters, which you call them the 12 proclamations.
Yes.
And it's basically helping companies transition from being an order taking to be seen as experts. Could we go maybe over like the entire process of what is an order taking company and how they can become an expert and be seen as an expert?
Yeah, and I think it's helpful for a designer or anybody who's on the front lines selling expertise to think of this kind of oversimplified idea. And the idea is this: you can be seen by the client as the expert practitioner in a patient-practitioner relationship or a client-practitioner relationship where you are the expert, or you can be seen by the client as a vendor in a vendor-customer relationship. And really those two ideas represent opposite ends of a spectrum, but it's really helpful for you to think of it as an either-or situation where you are either the expert and you're allowed to lead in the engagement, and if you're allowed to lead, you're allowed to lead in the sale, and if you're allowed to lead in the sale, then you will be allowed to lead in the engagement. Or you're seen as a vendor, you won't be allowed to lead in the sale, and you won't be allowed to lead in the engagement. And therefore, if you cannot lead in the engagement, if you cannot say to the client, this is the way this should be done, these are my recommendations, etc., if the client will not follow your lead, then you impair your ability to do your best work and certainly to make more money. So it's helpful for you to think of it as an either-or situation. You're either the vendor or you're the practitioner. And in the sale, the sale is the sample of the engagement to come. So you do not win the business from the vendor position and then somehow become the expert practitioner once you've been hired. So if you don't win from that expert practitioner position, then congratulations, you're a vendor, and as long as the engagement goes on, you're likely to be seen as the vendor. Now, there are some exceptions, very rare exceptions, where people can move from vendor status to expert practitioner status, but the vast majority of situations, and the default assumption should be that this will always be the case, is that if you win as the vendor, you are the vendor. So the idea behind the win without pitching approach to selling is really the idea of capturing that expert position. I sometimes call it the power position in the relationship, where you are seen as the expert practitioner. So there are things that you will have to do in the sale to gauge whether or not you are seen as the expert or you're seen as the vendor. But that's the idea.
Mm-hmm. So how can I establish myself, for example, as an expert and be seen as an expert in front of the client and not a vendor?
Yeah, it starts with positioning. So positioning is a term that we in the creative professions use to describe what others would call fundamental business strategy. So strategy, there are many definitions to the word strategy. In fact, an incredible amount. And if you ask people what is strategy, you'll get a wide variety of answers. But one of the definitions I like best comes from Michael Porter, formerly of Harvard Business School. He says, strategy is the answer to the question, how are we going to become and remain unique? So when we talk about positioning, we're talking about, that's an expression that was invented by Trout and Rees and popularized in the book of the same name. I think that came out in 1981. And so the idea of positioning your brand in the mind of the potential buyer, and by positioning, they mean positioning your brand relative to your competitors. So positioning is an exercise in relativity. So is strategy. How are we going to become and remain unique, in comparison to the many other choices that the client might think that they have? So it starts with positioning or strategy, which you can distill down into, I can give you 2 steps and 3 components to positioning. The first step is choose a focus. So, and a focus, the 2 elements of focus are discipline and market. What will you do, and for whom will you do it? And once you do that, then you narrow the field of your potential clients. So instead of possibly designing anything for anybody, you go from we do this discipline for this market. We help these people solve these types of problems. And once you narrow your focus, now the reason expertise requires a narrow focus is, and my friend and colleague David Baker, who just wrote a book called The Business of Expertise, he talks about this all the time, the idea of pattern matching. Intelligence is effectively pattern matching. So experts, we hire experts because they've seen the patterns. Our problem seems so unique to us. We don't know what to do. And they come along and say, oh, I've seen this 50 times. You are displaying classic symptoms of X. And they can only pick up those patterns if they narrow their focus and solve the same types of problems over and over again. And that's the problem with the generalist firm is they'll do things once or twice or 3 times, not long enough to see the pattern. So you need to narrow the focus of your firm to the point where you can see patterns. And that narrow focus forces a depth of expertise. So what you're really trying to do is you're trying to find an avenue to the deepest expertise possible. And the fastest way to deepen your expertise is to simply narrow your focus and quit trying to solve all of these problems. And that's the big challenge with the creative mind, because creativity is essentially the ability to see, and creative minds are drawn to problems that they haven't previously solved because they bring a novel perspective to that problem. So they're always in search of something that they haven't done before. So your business's need for focus is directly at odds with the individual creative brain and that need for variety. So you have to reconcile those two ideas, and that's a big reason why so many creative firms are poorly positioned. But I was talking about so there's a second step. The first step to positioning is choose a focus, which you can articulate as a discipline and a market. We do X for Y. The second part, so once you do that, you narrow your field of competitors from thousands to maybe dozens, or maybe a dozen, or maybe less than a dozen, maybe 4 or 5. It shouldn't be your goal in positioning to get to a category of 1. If you do that, you've gone too far. You've made a mistake. But now you're seen through your choosing a focus and solving the same types of problems over and over again, you're seen as an expert in X for Y. But there are other firms that also do X for Y, or X for a different market, or a different discipline for that same market. So they might be your competitors, and you might find yourself in a competitive situation where the client is considering you and 3 or 4 other experts. The way you win that second battle, you want to make that a battle of ideology. So the second step is to add a perspective. A perspective is an overarching viewpoint on how this discipline for market should be done. So, and then when you start creating thought leadership and doing marketing around your expertise, X for Y, it's always framed through that perspective, that overarching viewpoint. And people will read your content, or they'll come to your blog or podcast or watch your video or whatever, watch your speech. They'll come for the content because you're going to impart knowledge on X for Y, discipline for market, but they will hire you for your point of view. And that's what I mean by the second step of positioning, is making this an ideological battle. You're being considered along with 3 or 4 others. You're going to be hired because the client looks at the way, or listens to the way that you think about the problem and the way you see the problem, and that's going to resonate with that client. So you want, when you're speaking or you're publishing on X for Y, framed by your point of view or your perspective, you're looking for one of 2 reactions from a reader who is a prospective client. You want them, and it's essentially the same reaction, but they're kind of expressed as the opposite. The first reaction is, oh my God, this person, the author, the speaker, you think about these things the same way I do. We're like-minded people. We use the same mental models, or we think everybody else who thinks this is messed up. We think about things the same way. The opposite reaction, which is just as powerful, is, oh my God, I never thought of it that way before. You've forced me to think differently, re-examine the way I think about these problems.
Like opening new doors.
Yeah, so those are the, that's, you want to become an expert. That's the two steps are narrow your focus, and the elements of that are discipline and market. And then the second step is come up with an overarching point of view that is a little bit polarizing. And how polarizing your point of view is, polarizing means some people are drawn to you, but others are repelled. They don't agree with your point of view. How polarizing your point of view needs to be is really a function of competition density. So how big is the market you're playing in? How many potential clients? And then how many direct competitors are there? So if it's a really competitive space, then you need to be more polarizing. You need to have a point of view that's very controversial. And if it's not all that crowded, there's enough kind of business for everybody, then you don't need to be as polarizing.
But what if we can't find that point of view that's going to set us apart, right? I mean, we just know how to design good stuff.
Yeah.
And how can we find that point of view?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, you take the first step. And the point of view, I got lucky. I mean, my point of view is right there in the name of my book, and it's in the name of my business, Win Without Pitching. We're a sales training organization to creative professionals. And previous to that, when I launched the business, it was a consulting practice, a new business or sales and new business consulting practice to creative professionals. But I didn't understand the importance of a point of view. Our point of view, obviously in the name, is that you can win new business without having to give your ideas away for free, without having to be the vendor, etc. So it's all wrapped up in the name Win Without Pitching. And again, I got lucky on that, or maybe intuited something before I formally understood it. And the norm is, when I think of the agencies and design firms that go through our training program, when they do the positioning term and they're coming up with a focus and a point of view, the point of view, it often takes a while. So you just do the focus first, and then you start writing. And you try on different points of view. And there are some successful firms out there who don't have one overarching point of view. They might have 3 or 4 different points of view that don't conflict with each other. And so I really believe that if you're focused enough, and you're creating content, so you're writing, you're exploring, whatever the equivalent of writing is, podcasting, speaking, doing webinars, etc. You're creating content, and you're forcing yourself to think through ideas. So with every new article or issue or speech or webcast, you would try on a different point of view, and just explore, just like a young writer has to try on different voices, and in the end, you kind of mimic one author and then another favorite author, and in the end, you evolve a voice that is a combination of those and something that comes from within you, and that's your voice. It's the same with a point of view. So it doesn't necessarily come easily.
So it's basically trying different styles until you see what's your own style, something like that.
Yeah. Now I'm kind of I don't like saying this, but I'm kind of a contrarian at heart, and I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. But when I see everybody doing something, my reaction is, yeah, something's wrong. There's something horribly wrong and nobody sees it. That's just kind of the way I look at the world. So that's helpful for me to come up with alternative points of view. So what you would do is you arrive at discipline for market, X for Y, and then you ask yourself, okay, what are the conventions in this space? What is it that everybody does all the time that we think is kind of a law or an unwritten rule? What are the taboos? What are the things that you are absolutely not allowed to do, or rules you cannot violate? I like to say, what dragons need to be slayed? What are the big, horrible things that people, like in my business, pitching, there's just an assumption that I think 90% of the market out there, and more than 90% of, the businesses that I would consider to be competitors of ours, they don't actually believe that you can win without pitching. They don't believe it. I believe it to my core. So it's helpful for me to have a point of view that most others don't agree with. So what's the equivalent in your business? What's the thing that everybody does that if somebody from Mars showed up and looked at it, would say, well, why do you do it that way?
You mentioned this part in the book constantly, that writing is going to help you to set yourself apart and establish yourself as an expert. And what I wanted to ask is, how did it help you to establish as an expert in the industry?
Well, I told you when I went to school, I had to decide, was I going into business or was I going to study creative communications, journalism? And I really wanted to be a writer. I saw myself kind of as a writer who had entrepreneurial aspirations. So it's easy for me to say that because I'm a writer at heart, and more than half of what I do in my business, and for many years now, more than half of what I do is write. But I think it's very difficult to be a thought leader if you are not taking in information. And if you want to create a point of view, it's not enough to absorb information, because the act of writing is the act, and I'll use the word writing, but for some people, I recognize some people can't neurologically, they cannot get the thoughts from their brain through the fingers into a keyboard. So for those people, they could speak, they could record, they could do webcasts from bullet points, transcribe that. There are other ways to do it, but we'll just keep using the term writing. But it's not enough to take in information. You crystallize your ideas by writing, by something known as the Feynman technique, after Richard Feynman, who was a famous Nobel laureate physicist. He basically says, if you can't explain something to a toddler, somebody who's 8 years old, then you don't understand it. So to take an ideas and then to try to communicate it to an audience in a way that's succinct and easy for kind of the average layperson to understand, that forces you to get smarter about what you do. So there is a requirement to write. And again, I recognize some people just can't write and they have to choose another medium of expressing themselves. So find what works for you. But I cannot see any instance where somebody can become an expert in something without that high level of taking in information, synthesizing it, and then communicating it so that they validate to themselves that they understand it. They also actually further their own understanding. Charlie Munger, who's Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway, he's one of the richest men in the world, one of the smartest people too. He's in his 90s now. He has this great quote. I think it's Munger. He says, I've met the number of interesting, successful people I've met in my life who do not read all the time is none, zero. His point is, you need to be absorbing information all the time, and then I would add to it, you need to be synthesizing it and putting it out. And so can you become an expert without doing either of those things, taking information in, synthesizing, communicating out? I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. So it's like a must road. I mean, you have to do it.
I think so, yeah. And, of course, there are going to be exceptions out there. And you might say, well, in the design profession that isn't about words, yes, you can become an expert designer, but not in a way that allows you to communicate that knowledge so that it can support your sales or new business development efforts, right? So you could be the best designer in the world and not run a successful practice. Right. So if we're talking about being an expert, it's not just being an expert designer. It's being recognized as somebody who knows how to solve X for Y.
In other part of the book, you also talk about sales and addressing clients part. And I also want to talk a little bit about the sales, because I would say that most of the people see sales as something like, you have to manipulate people into buying something. You have to be that crazy extrovert guy that is constantly talking and these kind of things. And you have a chapter in the book which says we will rethink what it means to sell. what should we rethink about sales?
Well, first of all, that selling isn't, when done properly, isn't about talking people into things. I don't think you have any business trying to talk people into hiring you. I don't think that's what the client's looking for. I think you want to see the act of selling as kind of looking for the next perfect fit. So you have this criteria of X for Y, or we're experts of helping these types of clients solve these types of problems. And if you don't have that narrow focus, then you're going to view the act of selling as talking people into things, because anybody, any living, breathing human being or any business of any size could possibly hire you. And so you would see it as your job to communicate to them why they should hire you and what you might do for them. But when you're seen as the expert in X for Y, then you can reach out to people and say, hey, we have this thing that we do X for Y, you're in Y, we've helped other companies like yours, and name drop a few of those companies. Feel free to say no, but allow me to ask, is there any chance that we can be of assistance to you? And then look for people who are willing to engage in a conversation to see if there's a fit. And if they sense that you're not about to try to convince them of anything, that you are as discerning of the fit as they are, then they're more open to having a conversation. And I think that's how you should view sales.
You also talk about a new model of selling, and you talk about these 3 steps of helping, inspire, and reassure. Can we go over them in more depth?
Yeah. So first I'll say that if you want to... So I've just written another book. It launches on December 6th. It's on pricing. And for me to write that book, I had to read probably almost every book written on pricing over about 4 years. I read everything that was written on it, and I listened to a lot of people, and I synthesized ideas through my business and my client's business. And so I finally felt like, okay, I know enough to write a book for my market on pricing. When I wrote the Win Without Pitching Manifesto, so I was writing about selling, I had read very few books on selling. To this day, I own a lot of them. And there's very few. There's maybe 2 that I've read cover to cover. Maybe 1 that I've read cover to cover. Because I just don't identify with. It's not like I don't want to throw the entire sales profession under the bus, but I just don't identify with how some of these really high drive competitive salespeople tell you you should sell. And now, so with that setup, I've forgotten your question, Eugeniu. What is it? I'm prone to this from time to time, like every minute.
No worries. So the question would be, you're talking about the new model of selling, the helping, inspire, and reassure.
Yeah. So I wanted to say, so that's a truncated version of a change management model. So what I want to say, if you want to learn to be a better salesperson, you could go read books on sales. But I have a better idea. Go read books on leadership, or go read books on change management. And there are probably other fields too, but those 2, go read books on consulting, on coaching, because all of those things, leading others through change, managing the change of others, coaching others, consulting with others, that's really what selling should be. So you could pick any book on leadership, you could pick any book on change management, you could pick a lot of books on consulting, probably any book on coaching, and you could just swap out the main subject of the book and put in sales, and it would probably be a great model for how you should sell. So the model that I'm using and referencing in that book is a truncated version of something that's known as the trans-theoretical model. And it says people go through certain stages of change, and there are only a finite number of methods available to you to help yourself or to help others change. And the key to it all is that certain methods work at certain stages. Now, the author of that model might look at how I've truncated it, digested it down, and take issue with it, and that's fine. But I see those stages and methods as the followings, and I distill them into 3 steps. This first one is to help the unaware. So people who are unaware of the fact that they have a problem or an opportunity, it's not your job to confront them with the fact that their brand sucks or they need a new website or, a new mobile app is the solution to their marketing problem. It's not your job to talk them into that. So you're looking for people who already recognize that they have a need. And if they don't recognize that they have a need, you don't try to get a meeting so you can talk them into it. What you do is you ask if you can help slowly over time by sending them information that you write or create, and see if they'll, through exposure to your thinking, they'll come around to your point of view and they'll begin to think, maybe we do have a problem here, or maybe we do have an opportunity. That's what I mean first by help the unaware. And you do this primarily through your thought leadership. So content marketing, it's mostly targeted to those people and people at the next stage. The next stage is what I call the interested. So this next step is to inspire the interested. Once somebody recognizes that they have a problem or an opportunity, but before they've cemented the intent to take action on it. So at this stage, they're gathering information. They're actively looking for inspiration. And they're not looking for inspiration to hire your firm. They're looking for inspiration to form the intent to take action, to go from like contemplating to action in the language of the trans-theoretical model. So they go from, and so the act of inspiration through your portfolio, through saying to people, like, imagine what the possibilities are. That word imagine is a really powerful word at this stage. You're getting them to envision a better future, because at this stage of the buying cycle, which is also the stage of change, people overweight the positive implications of change, all of the good things that could happen, and they underweight the costs or potential consequences if things fail. But then that dynamic reverses. So through acts of inspiration, you can get them to decide, you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to rebrand the organization. I'm going to launch this new brand. I'm going to redo our entire web presence, whatever the thing is. But then shortly after they make the decision, shortly after they make the decision to take action, let me just close something here. Then what happens is buyer's remorse sets in. That's when the dynamic reverses. They decide, I'm going to do this. They say to you, okay, we're going to work with you. It might even be before they sign off, right? They decide they're going to hire a firm like yours to help them with whatever the challenge is. And then everything starts to change. They start to get nervous. They start to think about the things that could go wrong. In fact, they start to get nervous after they've made the decision to hire you. So or to hire a firm like yours. So in the conversations late in the sale, they're quite different than they are from early in the sale. Early on, the client's getting excited about what could be. And then later on, once they've actually formed intent, they're nervous. They're asking very granular questions about, well, how does this work? And what do you do here? And they're looking for all of the pitfalls, all of the problems. So if you can just recognize, if you can see sales as those 3 steps, help the unaware, inspire the interested, I didn't name the last one, it's reassure the intent. Those who have decided, yes, I'm going to do this, your job is to calm them down, not get them excited because they're already excited, or they were excited. Now it's just calm them down and let them know that everything's going to be okay. If you can view sales that way, those 3 steps, you'll make huge strides.
Sounds really interesting. So, regarding the whole sales part, and you also touched the pricing part, you mentioned that clients want to lease and not buy. What do you mean by that?
Clients don't always want to lease, but we all get trapped in our mental models, in our ideas and assumptions of how things should work. And one of the assumptions that we make, especially when it comes to anything to do with software, so anything web, anything application, one of the assumptions that hasn't changed fast enough is that clients want to buy a website or an app. But that's not how clients buy software these days. They buy software on a per seat per month basis. That's how they budget for software. That's how they prefer to pay for it. So here we are in late 2017, and the norm among dev shops of any kind, design and dev shops, like, and it's almost all digital these days. But if let's just keep it really simple. I need a new website. The norm among website design and development shops is to sell that when the client would prefer to lease it. Now, lease is the term that I use kind of loosely, because you license it. So lease, license, but the idea is that you pay for it on an ongoing basis. And so I'm not saying that that's what all clients want to do, but I think for the digital work in particular, you really want to think about, am I proposing to sell this in a way that the client wants to buy it? Does that make sense? And I'm talking about how they pay for it. And in the pricing book, I've got a chapter on this, and I talk about an example of had a client who her client wouldn't pay $50,000 for a website, but the client ended up paying $3,000 a month for 3 years.
Okay, so you say that it's always about finding that pricing model that fits the client too.
Yeah. And so there's so many things that we do on the selling front, but also on the pricing in particular. Like, another big mistake is we put a proposal in front of the client with one option. Therefore, there are really only two outcomes. 50% of the outcomes are positive, 50% of the outcomes are negative. But the real issue is you put a proposal in front of the client, and let's say it's for $25,000, services for $25,000. So you're asking the client to answer the question, is this worth $25,000? And the client's brain isn't really wired to answer that question. The client cannot determine whether or not your proposal is worth the price that you put on it without making a comparison. So whenever you put forward a proposal that only has one option, you force him to leave, either mentally or actually physically, and go away to make a comparison. So he can compare it to things that you've charged or he's bought from you previously. He can compare it to other things that he's obtained for the same amount of money, $25,000. Or he can go get quotes from other clients, from other other design firms, right? So that's what you're forcing him to do, because the question his brain is wired to answer is, which of these is the best value? So if you just put forward a proposal with 3 options, here's option 1, option 2, option 3, you're more aligned with the decision making that he wants to make. So now his brain can get to work on, okay, well, let's make the comparison and let's see which of these is the best value. So that's another example of pricing where most of us in the creative professions, if you just do that. I had a client, I'm going to see him in a few days, and he said to me, that idea of options alone increased his profit last year by 400%.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So it's like he's offering to a client multiple options of paying his service.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So because people usually, I read it somewhere that subconsciously we like to have options. I mean, not too many, but to have options to choose something from.
Yes.
So let's say when I propose to a client, let's say he wants a website. So I can suggest we either do, as usually we do, like a 50-50 per entire project, or he can pay it on a monthly basis, for example, for 1 year. This could be right as a solution.
Yeah, he could pay it monthly for 1 year, or he could say, so the company who designed our website, not most recently, but a few years ago, he's a friend of mine. And one day he said to me, okay, we need to redo your website. It's going to be $60,000. And I was an independent consultant at the time. And I said, there's no way I'm paying you $60,000 a month to do my website. I said, I'll pay you $3,000 a month forever, but I'm not paying you $60,000. He said, well, we don't sell websites that way. And then so we got it done somewhere else. And then one day he came back and he said, hey, we sell websites that way now. So just think of it this way. So we used to think of, here's the idea of a website. Your website is old and out of date. It's 4 years old, therefore it's irrelevant and it's killing you. So I'm speaking on the part of the client. So you decide, okay, it's time for a new website. So you go, you get some quotes, etc., and you spend $50,000 or 150 or 500 or 5,000, whatever the number is. Let's use $50,000. So you incur this $50,000, essentially a capital one-time expense, and then you depreciate it over 4 years. And what happens is 6 months later, it's already starting to become obsolete, right? And now the pace of obsolescence is so much faster than that. But this is the way it used to be. New website, okay, forget about it for 6 months, and then it starts to bother you. And about the 3 or 4 year mark, you throw it all out, and you start again with another capital expense. It's not the way it works now. It's not the way people buy. It's not the way the pace of change of websites is so much faster. I would be better off, the client would be better off saying, okay, I'm going to allocate so much money per month for the website. Maybe there's a design fee initially or a build fee initially, but if you could amortize that over the entire life of the website, if you said to me, listen, there's no one-time cost, but you're going to have to sign a contract a minimum of 3 years, and you're going to pay $3,500 a month. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a new website. We're going to always make sure that you're using the most up-to-date plugins, security features, whatever. Yeah. We're going to include these maintenance features that are specific to you, that you need. It might include some like marketing automation support or some other things. It might include like vetting new plugins as they come along. And it might include like a design refresh every 12 months. Right? So there's no need to rebuild it. Every 12 months we do a design assessment, et cetera. So you frame it as an ongoing relationship in which you take all of my website problems off of my plate and I just budget $3,500 a month forever. That's the way you want to think about structuring those relationships, because that's how clients buy software. Websites are just software.
Yeah,
customized software.
I agree. So to summarize everything we talked about, what would be step-by-step so companies can go and just implement everything we talked about and just become these experts in the field?
Yeah, so that's there's a lot to be done there, but we already talked about positioning. It begins with positioning. So I can distill the entire win without pitching approach, into 2 steps. The first one is to change the power structure in the buy-sell relationship through positioning. So we've already talked about that. And you change the power structure by becoming this narrowly focused, deep expert. And the second step, that's actually it's not the easy one, but it's kind of the simple. It's not even all that simple, but it's a simpler one. It takes a shorter period of time. Kind of. The second step is to leverage that power to change how your services are bought and sold. So once you're seen as meaningfully different, now you can start to push back in the sale and say, yeah, we're not going to do that. We're not going to submit a proposal to somebody that hasn't allowed us to sit down and have a conversation with them. You need to give us budget guidance first. Whatever it is about the client's buying process that you don't like, you start to push back on it and see how they respond. And if they start to acquiesce or make concessions to you, that's a sign that they see you as meaningfully different. And then that's a sign that it makes sense for you to proceed, that you're beginning to occupy the expert practitioner ground, and therefore if you're hired, you're probably likely to do your best work. So those 2 steps are gain power through positioning and then leverage that power to change how your services are bought and sold. And, so that's 100 or 2 words to describe it, but it's really a lengthy journey, right? And choosing a focus doesn't come easy to creative people for reasons that we've already talked about. But then once you do choose a focus, you just imagine this. You are reinventing your firm with every new client, one new client at a time. Each new client is hiring you for the expertise, sees you as the expert, is paying you a premium. And that's how, one step at a time, one new client at a time, you go from, the generalist vendor to the expert practitioner.
Coming to a close now, What would be some book recommendations, your personal book recommendations you would give to our audience? Let's say, okay, Win Without Pitching Manifesto and your upcoming
Yeah.
book.
Yeah, my upcoming book is called Pricing Creativity, A Guide to Profit Beyond the Billable Hour. It's only going to be available on winwithoutpitching.com, or you can go to pricingcreativity.com, and that's available in December.
What would be other top 3 books that you would recommend?
I think earlier this year I read Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1, Notes on Startups or Inventing the Future, I think it's called. And I actually did a webcast on it for the people in our program. I think it might be the best general business book I have ever read, and I've read a lot. So I would definitely recommend that book. I also like, this is going to sound odd, I like Oren Klaff's book called Pitch Anything. And when this was recommended to me, I thought, I'm the Win Without Pitching guy. I'm not going to read a book called Pitch Anything. But he comes from the money business where he's pitching investors, and it's a real kind of cutthroat competitive situation where you get in, you've got 20 minutes of somebody's time, etc. And the value of Klaff's book is in his idea of that he calls frame control. So I mentioned that you should think that there's only 2 positions available to you in the sale. You're either the vendor or you're the expert practitioner. And he talks about that idea very eloquently. And essentially, a frame is a point of view that you bring to a conversation. And in any social interaction, there are 2 frames that come together and they clash. He describes it as a violent coming together, and at the end of the interaction, only 1 frame prevails. So think of it this way. You come into the interaction, you see yourself as the expert practitioner, the client sees you as the vendor. At the end of that conversation, you're going to agree that you are either the vendor or the expert practitioner. So he's also a very good writer. So I would recommend that one. And the third one, David Baker's brand new book, The Business of Expertise. It's on entrepreneurship, being an expert entrepreneur. David has served over 1,000 independent creative businesses. By my estimation, he's raised the GDP of the United States by over $1 billion through all of the value he's created in the firms. There's nobody who's seen what he's seen or has the data that he has. And his book, it goes into positioning, it goes into lead generation. It's a really great complement to the Win Without Pitching Manifesto. It's called The Business of Expertise.
Blair, thank you very much for being here today.
My pleasure, Eugeniu.